Greetings all! Okay, I've been asked repeatedly to do a Booker video now that it's been cancelled, so here it is. Booker was, unusually enough it seems, a project which was pretty much on time, on budget, and did exactly what the Army wanted it to do. Yet, at this time of recording, Booker is not going to enter US service, despite a battalion's worth of the things being built. It could be worse, they actually put T-23 medium battalions into service, but they never left the US and were used only for training and evaluation. This would appear to be the second The Tragic Tale of video that I've done, so maybe I'm starting a series? Hope not. But anyway, so what went wrong? Why didn't the Army choose Vehicle X? Why replace Sheridan with a 40-ton vehicle which got too heavy to airlift, let alone airdrop? When will you do an Inside the Chieftain's Hatch on M10? Well, the latter is not anytime soon. I've been told in no uncertain terms that as long as the SEP V3 is in service, I will not be allowed to film inside Booker, as the vehicle is too similar to the tank, and the tank's interior is restricted. And unlike Private Snuffy, who will hook up a GoPro to his helmet and upload a gunnery to YouTube, the Army knows who I am. For a larger overview of how US vehicle procurement works in the modern era, I would direct you to my 2-hour interview with then Generals Dean and Norman, who were in charge of such things until recently. So what I've done over the past few months is trawl the records and try to establish a timeline of events and decisions to show the 12-year history of the project. Now, compared to World War II timelines, that still seems like an obscenely long time for a process which was on schedule. But hey, at least we're not trying to build a new warship. This is not going to be the definitive history. There are plenty of interesting and relevant documents which are sufficiently classified that I've not even seen them, and some which I've seen but I'm still not permitted to cite. Eventually, I presume it will all get declassified and written about, but for now, this is going to be the best overview you're going to get until I or someone else gets sufficiently bored to start filing FOIA requests. We're going to start in September 2015 with the Army's Combat Vehicle Modernization Strategy. Put out by TRADOC, signed by the Army's Vice Chief. This was a publicly released document, but if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. It didn't really make many rounds in the casual audience. Perhaps for the better, it perpetuates the occasional myth. Complete with apostrophe abuse, I know. Oh well. A more interesting quote in the document is, "In short, the Ukrainian battlefield is a harbinger of the complex environment the US will face in the future. A battlefield that requires mobile protective firepower, the integration of all arms, and counters to long-range artillery, UAS, air defenses, and tank protection systems." Who knew? Maybe the Army is a little bit more foresighted than commentators today might think. Appendix C is a particularly useful primer on the balance of modern vehicle design. Anyway, after a bit of general overview in the document, we get to the first public indications of the Mobile Protected Firepower, or MPF, program, which gave us M10 Booker. For the section on the Infantry BCT, we see the Infantry BCT lacks a lightweight combat vehicle that provides mobile protected firepower to enable freedom of movement and freedom of action, which are essential to expanding a lodgement and preventing enemy counterattack. This vehicle is essential to defeating local fortifications, point defenses, and blocking positions to maintain momentum. Also for Stryker, it makes reference to the lack of sufficient mobile protected direct fire support. Now, of course, MGS is in service, though not to the numbers originally envisioned in the program. The document then splits up the various priorities by time frame. The midterm was defined as 2022 to 2031. Quote, "While the infantry and Stryker BCTs provide the Army's greatest expeditionary potential and operational mobility respectively, both lack direct fire capability that allows these formations to gain overmatch when facing capable enemies in close combat. The Army must improve infantry and Stryker BCTs' maneuver capabilities by adopting an interim MPF capability while developing an objective MPF solution. The Army fulfills the interim requirements by modifying an existing combat vehicle or purchasing an off-the-shelf solution in modest quantities. In the mid and far terms, infantry and striker BCTs require a vehicle possessing exceptional all-terrain mobility and powerful, stabilized, direct fire while moving weapons, with sufficient protection to resist small arms fire and active or reactive protection to defeat anti-armor rockets and missiles. A highly mobile precision direct fire platform allows both the infantry and striker BCTs to counter the most immediate threats encountered during joint forcible entry. What's of note here is that they are talking in 2015 about MPF being something for IBCTs and SBCTs both. They are certainly not talking about it just being something for airborne forces. There's a reason for this. All airborne BCTs are IBCTs, but not all IBCTs are airborne BCTs. And this distinction leads to a major concept schism. I had mentioned this was the first public indication of a serious MPF project, but it was not the start of the story. The first initial capabilities document for MPF dated back to September 2013 and was triggered by the Army's Strategic Planning Guidance. The SPG is a pretty high-level document and it doesn't make direct reference to any particular vehicle capability, but it does continue the reset which had started the year prior away from the coin focus of the War on Terror and back towards more conventional expeditionary activities. One of the things which came out after the guidance was an operational needs statement provided by 82nd Airborne in August 2013, basically saying, "We want a chuckable vehicle." By January 2015, after a number of revisions, it was very definitely focusing on MPF as an airdroppable vehicle. However, it was envisioning this vehicle being applied to non-airborne IBCTs and other roles as well. Basically, after doing the assessment of what 82nd wanted the vehicle for, there was a realization that the capabilities gap existed for a number of BCTs. Effectively, what they realized they wanted was a vehicle which could be used in decisive combat operations regardless of how it got there, but which could be airdropped. The list of lethality capabilities does set the vision for what this thing was supposed to do. Note that bunkers is top of the list, armored vehicles at the bottom. By June 2015, however, this had changed. At this point, they're looking less at high-level concepts and more at the practical realities of, okay, we got this great idea for an all-singing, all-dancing AFV, but what does this look like in practice as implemented as part of a brigade? Also of import, the target audience for the vehicle has changed to include striker BCT. So, they grabbed a few soldiers, engineers, and artists and sent them to the Soldier Innovation Workshop in Detroit. Put them the question of, so if you really had a blank slate, what would you ask for and why? And these images are from summer 2015. I don't know if I prefer the Warthog or the half-track Corvette. But interestingly, none of them look much like tanks. At this point, they hadn't really settled on anything at all, and were quite willing to consider a tracked vehicle in the striker formation or a wheeled one in the infantry brigade. Further concept testing would start to whittle down the very large set of possibilities, but already they were focusing on tracks to meet the likely turning radius requirement imposed by urban fighting. Skid steer, such as on the AMX-10RC, is still an option though, if it can handle other issues like rubble. The airdroppable requirement was still a consideration, however, with a few weight limits being identified. Regardless of the payload capacity of the aircraft, there are two additional restrictions which are relevant. The first is the location of the weight moving around the aircraft compared to the location and the amount which is still being lifted. It turns out, if you want to chuck 3 vehicles out of a C-17, you want all of them to be under 16 tons. Then there is the limit of the parachutes. In 2015 at least, the heaviest you could chuck out was somewhere under 20 tons. The M8 AGS barely made the limit in airdrop configuration. Now it turned out that the Striker MGS could also be airdropped, and that was tested in 2004, but apparently it didn't go without some damage to both aircraft and vehicle. Finally, the engineers figured that they could most likely develop a parachute system which came in at a 25-ton capacity and possibly even a 30-ton capacity, putting an ultimate top-end weight limit on an airdroppable vehicle. Again, they were still in the just how are we going to do this phase with no set design requirements. Instead of a cannon, be it a 30mm or a 120mm, maybe you could have a missile armament or a direct fire capable mortar system. A recoilless rifle would give big punch on a lighter vehicle, and these were all proposed for consideration. How about armour packages, which could be used similar to the M8 AGS and may be installed after landing? No answers, no preconceptions, they're still just trying to decide the questions. One of the reasons for this is that in very late 2013, the Army took a look to see what was out there. It's reasonable enough. It is cheaper and faster to take something which already exists, which can do the job, and use that. And again, I'm trying to avoid making some side comment about FREM frigates. Anyway, they hit their copies of Jane's Armour and Artillery, or whatever it is, and looked at 35 vehicles. As you can see, some of them are questionable as practical options. I mean, maybe it would be possible to trade for the SK-105s, but good luck reopening the M551 lines, and the RDF LT didn't even have a line. What the hell is in Mombambe? This apparently devolved into a technical assessment of what appeared to be possible within the required characteristics. Of the final 14, these were the closest 5, but they all had issues or limitations. And my favorite comment is the one on the Wiesel. Anyway, the end result was that no vehicle was deemed suitable, even if they could somehow be acquired or put into production. The M8 was the closest, but it still required a lot of work to modernize. So much for buying commercial off the shelf. CV90 fans will note it was not in the final 5. It was considered possible, but would require significant reworking. So to recap, at the end of 2015, we have an identified need for a vehicle which will perform adequately for all types of IBCT and maybe SBCT, whilst retaining airdrop capability, and nothing currently even on the second-hand market would suit. Money was set aside in the Program Objective Memorandum 2017 to 2021, which is basically a funding plan set up for that 5-year period, in July 2015. Right, on to the next stage in the Capabilities Development document of February 2016. At this point, they're still very much keeping the airdrop requirement in mind even for leg IBCTs, but there is a lot more discussion here about Airmobility instead. Must be able to carry 72 hours worth of fuel and a day's worth of ammo, which is reasonable enough given the resupply issues inherent near landings. But there's a requirement to be in fighting condition within 5 minutes of coming off the ramp. And I have shades of the M22 Locust here. Now, if you missed it, this was a tank designed to be landed behind enemy lines by a C-54 Skymaster. The tank was combat capable as soon as the hull drove around and was mated to the turret after landing. The flaw was that you were supposed to land in a contested area that needed a tank with a strategic lift asset. I might question the requirement of getting a vehicle to fighting order within 5 minutes of coming off of a C-17. Who is landing a C-17 in a location where an hour or two is going to make a critical difference? And how quickly can you land and park aircraft on an occupied airfield to start unloading all these things? Now, unfortunately, some of these opposed air assault type philosophies will remain in the program even after the requirement for it goes away. In the event, the 5-minute requirement was changed to 15 minutes later in the program, and it was able to meet it, but it never went to a, you probably have a bit of time to load ammo and fuel requirement. Another recurring theme is mobility in the restricted terrain and limited infrastructure common to IBCT dismounted operations. At this point now, the Army is starting to focus on more specific requirements, and it lists out various firepower capability issues in order of priority. Firstly, troops up to 2 kilometers for the ATGM threat. Secondly, a wall breaching capability. Apparently there is a NATO standard for the quality of reinforced concrete wall to be fired at, and a standard for breach points to create it in such a wall. Who knew? Either way, MPF had to be able within a set amount of rounds to punch a hole about 3 feet by 4 feet so that a soldier could pass through without pausing to move any rebar. Then bunker engagement, and again there are apparently NATO standards for construction of sample target bunkers. At this stage, armor penetration against tanks and the like is not a requirement. And this seems fair enough, and IBCT does have a lot of equipment already capable of engaging tanks. A commander's RWS was at this stage also required. Not available in the unclassified documentation is the protection level required. Another required feature was air conditioning. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Army has conducted studies on the effectiveness of personnel, varying by temperature, and the chances of their making a mistake above or below certain temperatures. There are a slew of other requirements listed, most of which are not eyebrow-raising, but some are still interesting in that they were even requirements. We've been looking at things like wall climbing ability or gap crossing as an Army requirement for vehicles from pretty much day one. But 0 to 30 acceleration time was actually a new one for me. And turning radius I also don't recall ever seeing before either. Another new one to me is the idea that the smoothness of a vehicle's ride is measured in watts by placing a sensor on a seat location. Makes sense, but either way, it seems that there is a NATO reference mobility model for different types of cross-country terrain to measure the bounciness. I'm starting to see a trend here. There are even hacking protection requirements these days in modern vehicles. In the meantime, in early 2016, there was serious consideration being given to an interim MPF capability for the sake of giving troops something pretty much right now to fill the gap. One option, Stryker MGS. The other was former US Marine Corps LAV 25s. Both were relatively cheap and fast options, and both were ultimately, obviously enough, shelved. But the LAVs shall make a return in the story. In any case, the process continued, and on 17th June 2016, an Army Requirements Oversight Council gave approval for the basic guidance to start moving forward. This then went up to a higher level approving authority in early July, and at this point we're talking some serious horsepower with positions filled at the time by names like Milley, Allen, Donahue, McMaster, Funker, Shapiro. If this lot wanted or didn't want a vehicle, it would or would not happen. They looked at the AROC guidance, made a few arbitrary changes. They put in a specific tank type threat to be destroyed, and changed the bottom end of the acceptable cannon caliber from 30mm to 50mm, which should give an indication of the specific type of tank threat to be destroyed. They're obviously not talking about taking on T-90s here. That said, they did want to future-proof the vehicle with the ability to upgrade to a 120. At this point though, a very significant change was made. Airdrop was moved to desired, not required. Now, for those of you who are particularly bored, and I really wouldn't recommend browsing it as a pastime, there is a website called sam.gov, which is where the government puts out contract opportunities to market. And on 16th July 2016, the government did so for MPF. This was a sources sought market survey, the purpose being as shown below. Now of note, they are specifically requesting non-development items, which is basically procurement speak for commercial off-the-shelf. The Army wasn't going to waste time or money on development of an entirely new vehicle, although some tweaking would be acceptable. Now remember that market survey from a couple of years earlier which said nothing out there suits? Either something has been made since, which suits, or the reduction from airdrop required to airdrop desired will open up contenders. There's a little more to the announcement than just what do you have which suits, but that's the major gist of it. Turnaround times, 2 weeks for RFIs, i.e. questions for clarification, and 1 month for submissions. The long-term timeline was announced as the Army conducting an analysis of alternatives in FY 2017 with a competitive request for proposal FY 2018 with an award in FY 2019. GDLS did not hang around pushing its proposal. By October at the AUSA convention, they had put together a concept vehicle, Griffin, which is basically a 28-ton, 120mm cannon-armed vehicle with an Ajax hull with a bespoke turret up top using Abrams internals. They called it a conversation piece to show what could be done quickly, but it was not intended as a specific solution to the US Army's requirement because the Army had not yet put out a requirement. Not to be outdone, BAE also brought out an expeditionary light tank to the same show, which took the M8 design and mated it with a Bradley-based hull and additional CV90 sourced internals. The entire public history of the contracting process can be traced on a SAM site, but again I must warn you that it is not for the faint of heart or short on time. Modern procurement is an unholy mess of annexes, requirements, spreadsheets, and so on. I am sure the contractors have entire teams of people whose sole job it is to change those files into something understandable and then distribute the right file to the right department in the company. I am certainly not going to go through them all on this video. Most of it isn't relevant, but by mid-December 2016, the survey questions had changed a little bit to focus on things like, how much money would it take you to modify something to suit and provide a demonstrator? Pure off-the-shelf solutions had been dropped. Apparently no manufacturer had anything which directly met the requirements. Some of those updates are just answers to questions, and you'll note that to keep it fair, it looks like if any one contractor asked for clarification on something, it was assumed that all contractors should know the answer, which presumably also means that questions have to be vague enough not to give away any secrets. Anyway, the analysis of alternatives did indeed happen in mid-2017. Again, this is just a process for refining the requirements. This was not a selection process for any one company's product versus any other company's product, given the huge variances possible in cost or capability between a proposed wheeled 105 and proposed tracked 120. However, informed by the responses received from industry, some assumptions could be made to start evaluating characteristics. They knew, for example, that industry was telling them a tracked 105 was likely to be lighter and smaller than a wheeled 105, and both of them would have been lighter and smaller than the tracked 120. They had taken surveys of requirements from the field forces, and the response back was that if a JLTV could go somewhere off-road, the MPF should be able to as well. They analysed the number of cities around the world, measured every street and intersection, and looked to see what percentage of a typical city each type of platform could even get to. And wheeled, by the way, did not do even remotely well there. They looked at life cycle costs, organizational manual requirements for crewing or maintenance, recovery vehicle requirements, weapons capability, and even wondered what would happen to the timelines if there was a protest made by a losing competitor. These would then have all been put into some form of a calculator and assessed on the various requirements and priorities. And the top priority was listed as speed of fielding, followed by cost. Whatever the vehicle was going to be, the Army didn't feel it was able to afford to wait for the perfect one. What does seem to have happened by this point, however, is any reference to incorporating MPF into Stryker units. Things seem to only be about IBCTs. With Stryker Dragoon in the process for entering service into Stryker units alongside MGS, there was a legitimate question as to whether or not MPF was still needed for Stryker brigades. Plus, the Stryker folks weren't too thrilled about a program which might be tracked, ending up in their otherwise wheeled formations. Also going on in mid-2017 is a field experiment of giving armoured vehicles to IBCTs. In March of 2017, 82nd Airborne started to receive a few former US Marine Corps LAV 25A2s, spending the next year conducting evaluations of just how an armoured vehicle might assist the light infantry to include at a JRTC rotation. The experiment proved successful enough that it was extended through 2018 and the LAVs were Airdrop certified. General feedback was that the troopers were quite happy with having the additional capability. The request for proposals went out on the SAM site in October 2017, and this is the first document which asked companies not what sorts of things are feasible, but send us your proposals that you want to sell us and their costs. With indication that they were going to end up providing 2 ballistic turrets and hulls, 12 pre-production vehicles with an option for 1 or 2 batches of 26 low-rate initial production vehicles, and the retrofit of 8 of the pre-production vehicles to LRIP standard. At this point, it is still advertising the capabilities document as a draft, but at this point you're presumably to the stage that only minor future requirements are going to be made. The final capabilities document was written in December 2017. It has shall have requirements and should have requirements, i.e. the must-haves and the nice-to-haves, one of the latter being manned or optionally manned operation. But by this point, completely absent from either the shall have or should have criteria was airdropping. This was no longer a factor to be considered in the selection of the vehicle. And incidentally, unmanned went away in 2022, about the same time that the optionally manned fighting vehicle, which is now XM30, became the minimally manned fighting vehicle. The technology just wasn't there yet. Put simply, the Army had concluded after its industry surveys that it was impossible to make a vehicle which could do everything it wanted MPF to do and survive against everything that it wanted it to survive against, whilst still retaining airdrop weights of under 20 tons. There was a thought that achieving it was possible with the development of a new parachute system, somewhere around the mid 20-ton capacity, but that then would lead to the next question. How much is the Army going to want to rely on such a new parachute system being developed and working soon enough to be relevant for the MPF program? And should the MPF program be paused until they can find out if this new parachute system will even be successfully made? Plus, there is the risk of weight growth over time, which could overwhelm the proposed new parachute system. In the meantime, there are some 33 IBCTs with a capability gap which needs filling as soon as possible. 28 of these IBCTs couldn't give a damn if the vehicle was airdroppable or not. The airborne units could still receive the vehicle. It's not as if they always get airdropped when they're sent somewhere. And once on the ground, their fighting needs are the same as that of any other IBCT. There were other requirements which obviously narrowed down the possible entrance. Fire on the move basically took missile-armed vehicles out of the equation. Neutral steer took pretty much all the wheeled vehicles out of the equation. Sorry, Centauro fans. Anyway, this final document, together with an ungodly amount of other citations and references, down to the authorized colors which can be painted on the vehicle inside or out, and including the official standards for C-17 transportability, were put out to the various contractors who might have been interested. And this became the official "what does the Army even want?" question, which can be philosophically debated. Was the Army correct in requiring neutral steer? Was it correct in requiring sufficient capability and survivability that it could not be airdropped? Was it correct in requiring fighting capability within 15 minutes of getting off the C-17's ramp? Was it correct in allowing the possibility of armor packages to increase effective armor? Or even at the larger level, of all the things the Army could have spent money on, was it correct in requiring an assault gun for IBCTs in the first place? And these are valid things one can find argument to support or attack, but this was a requirement that was set out. Statements like, "this was supposed to be an airdroppable vehicle but it grew too big," are false. There was no requirement had ever been put out by the Army for airdrop. The Army said, "we are going to spend money on a vehicle with a top weight limit of about 40 tons to fit 2 in a C-17, which is going to play assault gun for light infantry support." And that is exactly what the Army got as intended. Now, this request for proposals, of course, is a critical phase in the story of Booker. Anyone saying the Army should have bought this vehicle or that vehicle is assuming that there was some purchasing manager who's able to go to a showroom floor and say, "I'll take a dozen of those to try out, please." Particularly, for example, "I'll take a dozen CV90s. This is not what happened. The Army just said, "sell us your best offer to meet these requirements," and it was industry who decided what to bring to the table. 3 companies applied. Science Applications International merged a Cockerell turret with an ST engineering hull. GDLS updated Griffin. The hull was modified significantly from the original Ajax. You'll note, for example, that there was a rear hatch on the AUSA demonstrator, whilst the submitted Griffin had a cooling system in the rear instead. And the turret, of course, is much closer to that of M1's. BAE decided that the M8 ELT-based design was the best suited. They could have submitted CV90, they chose not to. Now, there's a note I saw somewhere saying that it was a result of the determination of the main gun, that if a 120mm was required, it would be a tailored CV90 which would be submitted, but the 105 requirement would be met by the M8 type. Now, to be clear, this is a bespoke vehicle based on ELT and it is not just a reworked M8, but the design lineage is obvious. There are 2 reasons for this preference for the M8 ELT type that I'm picking up on. The first was that they were still hopeful of keeping within a theoretically airdroppable weight, maybe with a future parachute system. Now, given this was no longer a consideration in the competition at hand, given the written requirements, it seems an odd rationale, but that is what I am hearing. The Army set out its rules and criteria for evaluation clearly in advance. The other is a far more rational reason. They believed that the ELT type vehicle would better meet the Army's desires. Remember, it's not only a matter of does it have armor mobility and firepower. If you look at the various requirements for submission in the SAM announcement, the proposal is incredibly complex, varying from submit the critical task list for the personnel who are going to be supporting a thing, from operators to trainers and maintainers, to matters of part supply, which on the ELT was rather broadly linked. As an IBCT vehicle, very restrictive terrain is a factor. You will recall that the Army was measuring percentages of roads which a vehicle could use. The CV90 based vehicle would be able to use a lesser percentage, move in less dense forests, and so on. Infantry could fight anywhere. The ELT could support them in most places. CV90 could support them in fewer places than the ELT. Basically, in the eyes of BAE, given the Army's requirements, if the M8 ELT-based vehicle wasn't going to win, the CV90-based vehicle certainly wasn't going to win. CV90 fanboys blamed the company, not the Army, and explained to the company why they were wrong to submit one of their products over another. It would take somewhere over a year for the proposals to be evaluated and down-selected, with the announcement made in December 2018 that GDLS and BAE would move forward with their proposals. GDLS released its first photos of its MPF submission the following month. They apparently weren't hanging around. BAE didn't show off theirs until April, but it was obviously based on the 2016 ELT. A lot of Army programs will go at this point into a design phase, allowing more opportunity for refinement to meet requirements, but in the interest of speed, the design phase was skipped for Booker. Basically, bring what's reasonably ready now. Anyway, both companies submitted their candidate vehicles. Again, all I can do for the GDLS vehicle is show the video that I did with the program manager outside the walk around, and the BAE submission I've covered inside and out. As we know, the GDLS candidate was successful. This doesn't necessarily mean that the BAE vehicle was not acceptable, just that the GDLS candidate won. It is public knowledge that BAE was disqualified due to some failures to meet contract requirements, but as far as I know, what the failings were has never been publicly announced, but there were a couple. The lack of a protest from BAE also indicates to the public that it was not some arbitrary decision and that the disqualification was justified. That said, after having crawled around inside and outside of both vehicles, I'm quite satisfied that the vehicle that I would have preferred to operate won, contract issues or not. Of interest, one of the documents apparently gave a height range to the 85th percentile of Army's population as an upper limit, as opposed to the more normal 95th percentile, which may account for some of the crampedness I experienced, but the design is still an exercise in volume efficiency over crewability, at least in the case of BAE. And I know I'm not the only person to think such, although admittedly from comments from the test crews, the BAE vehicle wasn't actually all that bad if you're not on the taller end of the scale. Still prefer the GDLS hatches mine, no matter how small you are. I'll also reiterate for those who think that it's an important consideration that the autoloader was not a factor. That the turret crew for the GDLS vehicle needed little retraining also turned out to be a side benefit, but was not a stated selection criterion either. And the same can be said for the BAE's vehicle's easier maintainability. And this is a lesson learned perhaps for future programs. Anyway, side aside, go check out those videos if you wish. The Soldier Vehicle Assessment and Limited User Test was basically the field selection process, with a platoon of each vehicle being given to soldiers to try out. GDLS's showed up in December 2020, they were Team Gold. BAE's, Team Black, showed up after COVID delays in July 2021. It did mean, however, that the crews assigned to the GDLS vehicle had a several-month head start on getting to know their kit. The test process ran through late November and ended up with a crew swap. Gold and Black platoons spent a week on each other's vehicles and filled out surveys with observations from a fresh set of eyes, which could be used to add changes to the LREP vehicles. And if you look closely, some of the changes are obvious, like the skirt hinges or the steps. At any rate, regardless of my personal preference, since they didn't ask me, although happily in agreement with them, the GDLS design won, and it was ordered into low-rate initial production. There then was the important matter of giving the thing a better name. XM1302 Tank Combat Full Track Light 105mm may have been specific, but little inconvenient to say and had a significant issue. it was designated as a light tank, as that was the closest authorized type designator in the official menu that the folks doing the naming could select from. So in September 2022, the proper nomenclature was provided by requesting an exception to policy. Combat Vehicle, Direct Fire, Full Tracked 105mm XM10. They're going to go with XM10 for two reasons. Firstly, the number 10 wasn't currently in use for anything with which it might get confused, and it's easier to say than M1302. They were learning from World War II, obviously. And secondly, since the M10 provided direct fire support in World War II, and this new thing was also intended to provide direct fire support, it seemed appropriate. Got it, the World War II M10 was a tank destroyer, not an assault gun. But in fairness, the 1944 revision of FM 18-5 did make bunker busting an officially sanctioned activity for the thing, so close enough, I guess. As you can imagine, I've covered World War II TD doctrine at length elsewhere, as I have the US Army's designated assault guns. The World War II similarity continues with the change to combat vehicle. It looks like somebody in the Army's nomenclature system was familiar with what happened in World War II with the tank destroyer units, where folks saw a thing which looked a hell of a lot like a tank and decided to use it like a tank. Not always to the best result, and definitely counter to the doctrinal reason it was there for in the first place. I've covered this before as well. Anyway, combat vehicle was specifically chosen to reinforce the vehicle's doctrinal purpose and to try to disincentivize people from thinking of it as a tank and using it primarily in situations for which it was not intended to be primarily used. They then undermined all this by, I think, making a very understandable mistake. They gave the vehicle to tankers. Now, it makes practical sense for testing. 19 kilos are already familiar with heavy tracked vehicles, large cannon systems, gunnery, and so on. However, if you give a group of tankers something which looks a lot like a tank and has a lot of the characteristics of a tank, the chances are they're going to try to use it as a tank. One notes that in World War II, the German Army's assault guns were crewed by artillerymen, not tankers. And this led to a decidedly different philosophy of operation of the same equipment after slugs started being issued to tank units due to lack of enough actual tanks, as compared to being issued to infantry units to be used as assault guns. Now, if you think this isn't important, try to tell infantry branch that as an indirect fire asset, mortars should be run by the artillery branch. And to be fair, in some armies they are, but in the US they consider that the direct support relationship is sufficiently integral that only infantry truly understand how best to provide the fires that they provide, where they're needed, when they're needed in the close fight. So maybe they missed a trick by not starting with Bradley crews, creating an 11 kilo MOS and making an infantry operated vehicle with a crew bias in that direction. Then again, they're moving the other way with 19 Charlies for crewing infantry Bradleys, so I guess I'm out of touch with modern US Army thinking. Certainly the use of 19 kilos was not preordained. They initially tried just taking the paratroopers and training them to operate the vehicles, but it didn't work out well, and the deliberate decision was made to go with tankers. Apparently the trials unit did look heavily into the 1990s FM 17-18 and 17-15 to inspire their light armor operations. Hopefully they also looked into the World War II era FM 17-36 for tank infantry cooperation. Some of you may have seen a training circular for the M10 gunnery, where it describes the M10 as a medium tank. And this was not an official designation, any more than the same manual describing M1 Abrams as a heavy tank. For starters, any document saying we are going to use this term for simplicity by definition is not using the official nomenclature. And MCOE is not the deciding authority for nomenclature, or for doctrine as it happens. It does, however, have great influence on doctrine, so how the tankers felt the vehicle should be used would end up perhaps being a bit more like a tank than originally envisioned. Remember, the trials unit was not only a technical assessment of the vehicle, they were also writing the manuals on how to use it. But overall, this is a minor issue compared to others. The common name was selected about a year later. There was an original list, which included Hellcat, keeping with the World War II TD theme, I guess, and Eisenhower, who you may recall had a good armor and infantry crossover in his operational history. But maybe some of you just didn't like the idea of an infantryman in trouble getting on the radio, "Bring up an Ike!" I know, works for me. The 6-name shortlist was 3 enlisted and 3 generals. In order of preference: Booker, Rivers, Gavin, just kidding, Starry, Ridgway, Powell and Kuma. Of interest, the troops on the BAE vehicle started calling it Kuma in testing. Once sufficient vehicles were built to do some initial testing, it was time to stand up the first test unit for initial operational testing. And here I think they made another error. The unit stood up was from the 82nd Airborne. Again, I think I can understand why. The 82nd is the US's Ready Response Force. It arguably would need the vehicle's capabilities sooner than any other unit. It was also the unit which wrote up the original operational needs statement back in 2013, although for an entirely different type of need. However, of all the units the vehicle was slated to go to, the 82nd was one of the ones it fitted into the least. By giving it to 373 Armour, the old Airborne armour unit, it inherently associates the vehicle as Sheridan replacement, and thus invites direct comparison in the common discourse. Now, in the long term, it wouldn't have mattered. People would have seen the vehicle doing exactly the same job in 10th Mountain, 4th Infantry Division, 40th ID, and would have the larger context. But by the time the vehicle's procurement was curtailed, people only saw vehicle which replaced Sheridan, which can't be thrown out of an airplane. And I think it framed the entire discussion around the vehicle incorrectly and has led a lot of commentators down the wrong path. The first major field test happened July 2024 through February 2025. There was another minor problem in selecting the 82nd to be the test unit in that Fort Liberty was not really set up for heavy armoured vehicles. There's no gunnery range, and there's no armoured recovery vehicle support. Gunnery would have to happen in Fort Stewart, Georgia, and if the vehicles got sufficiently stuck in Fort Liberty that they could not self-recover, it will be 30th Armoured Brigade of the North Carolina Army National Guard, which would come to their rescue with their M88s. A vehicle also made a trip to the Fort Dix area where the Air Force has a load test and evaluation site, and they were able to strap an M10 into a C-17 to make sure it could be done. Interesting, when you load 2 M10s into a C-17, they're loaded facing away from each other with deterrents in the middle of the aircraft, which I guess makes some sense from the weight and balance perspective. Regardless of whether using the vehicle as a tank was the correct move or not, there is no denying that the vehicle was eventually universally popular. The crews were very happy with it. It was comfortable with that hydrogas suspension, or was reliable, and of course to a 19 kilo quite familiar. And the larger organization was also very happy with the additional capability which the vehicle brought to the fight. The vehicle wasn't perfect, but quirks and design flaws are common with any new vehicle being introduced. Some of the problems were engineering related and easily fixed, like cooling issues, excessive fumes, or breaking center guides. And some of the problems were the sort of thing which make you go, oh, of course, when they became obvious through practical use. So for example, it's known that the M10 basically uses an M1's fire control system, but unlike an M1, M10 operates in close support of infantry, and infantry tend to operate in restricted terrain with short sight lines. You don't want by 13 magnification to acquire and engage a troop-sized target at 50 to 200 yards, which is a common infantry fighting range. But in by 3 magnification, an M1's thermal has no gunnery reticle. They literally had to hip shoot. Now, I presume it's an easy software fix, but it was a needed fix regardless. There was one major problem which was a little bit persistent, and that was that the vehicle couldn't hit the broadside of a barn from the inside with canister. Crews were failing gunnery and had lost their confidence in the vehicle and their ability to do their combat job. Now, this made no sense, as during the selection process, everything worked fine. But when they were doing that public live fire at the official naming ceremony, behind the scenes, there's a lot of sacrificed chickens, crossed fingers, and incantations to the machine spirit, which apparently worked as all the rounds hit. Turned out that during the change to LRIP production, some turret drive miscalibration had snuck in. There was an error in the ballistic solutions for some of the ammunition types, and there were a few other issues relating to gunnery standards, which, as you can imagine, it all caused huge consternation, a major effort to fix it, and then the solutions themselves were actually pretty quick and easy once the problems had been identified. By April 2025, the worst of it was over, and the crews were passing gunnery. Anyway, it seems likely that all the problems would have been fixed, and if we're up to the users, even the 82nd who couldn't chuck it out of an airplane, they would have kept it with glee. Now, I guess they could always drag those LAV 25s back out if they really needed to airdrop armour, whilst knowing that it wasn't anywhere near as combat capable as a Booker. However, it was not up to the users. April 27th, Defence One released an article which absolutely murdered M10, and unfortunately is also the primary source of information in the general public sphere on the cancellation. I happened to be in Fort Leavenworth alongside an officer involved in the Booker fielding at the time, and obviously enough, I asked him about it, opining that the article to me seemed to be like 90% wrong. He was more generous, saying it was 80%. A week later, the curtailment was announced, that Booker would stop after 80 or so were produced, and suddenly the Defence One article made more sense. It is one of those articles where nothing in there is really wrong, but it is a yes minister level masterclass on controlling a narrative. Upon my expressing the thought that it was an article put out to support cancelling the vehicle, one general officer used the term character assassination piece to make the cancellation more palatable. Now, here's the rub though. Arguably the vehicle should have been cancelled, and much earlier on in the programme. And indeed, it was repeatedly proposed to be cancelled, but not for the reasons commonly discussed. The thing about starting out as an airdroppable tank I've gone over earlier, that went, we can't realistically have an airdroppable tank, but now we're looking at the problem set, we could find a use for a more capable vehicle in the Army's light infantry forces. Airdrop was never a program requirement. Can't fly two in a C-17? Absolutely you can. The C-17 hasn't suddenly gotten smaller or reduced its maximum takeoff weight. Even its maximum payload remains the same as far as I know. What has changed is the aircraft's dry weight. Nobody told the Army, but the C-17 has apparently added a couple of tons in various modifications over the years. Now, it's not uncommon for an aircraft to have a maximum payload which cannot normally be attained. When I'm flying a 4-seat Cessna 172, I can't carry 4 adults in it. It goes over max takeoff weight, unless I empty a bit of fuel from the wings. If I offload 100 pounds of fuel, I can add another 100 pounds of adult. Further, part of the program requirement for M10 was to have a bit of room for growth. At this point, it's well known that any vehicle we buy today will get heavier over time. So there was already a little bit of a buffer in capacity in the M10's C-17 weight compatibility. However, the Air Force also has rules regarding the risk it's willing to take with its aircraft. For example, likely routes, especially departing from places which can be hot and humid, a bit like Fort Bragg is, they will require a set amount of fuel in the aircraft for them to be comfortable. I'm sure they can do mid-air refueling or stopovers or whatever, but it's a hassle. Turns out, if you place 2 fully combat-loaded M10s into a C-17 and remove the amount of fuel needed to stay within flight limits, it goes below the Air Force's safety margins. Or, if you put more fuel in it, it goes beyond airframe wear limits, or something like that. I've heard both. I'm not an Air Force C-17 engineer, but it could be both for all I know. It's not that they can't physically fly, but air crews are naturally safety oriented and they get a little bit nervous. It is not, however, a hard stop. The Army was working with the Air Force to set up a waiver process to restore 2 per aircraft official capacity. It's just a paperwork thing. It's also worth noting that the breach in the limit is so close that if you don't fully combat load the thing, you can still fly 2 in an aircraft without a waiver, so for pretty much training exercises, it doesn't come up as a factor anyway. If you're flying the vehicles to war, and you'd argue that there's already some risk involved. The vehicle and crew might get blown up in combat after all, so the risk of the weight waiver being approved is likely acceptable. The thing about Fort Campbell bridges being an issue doesn't seem to be an issue in Fort Liberty, where much of the testing was taking place. What isn't mentioned is which bridges and where. Now, believe it or not, at 40 tons, Booker is not the single heaviest vehicle in an IBCT. That award, at least that I've been able to track down thus far, goes to a Hammett cargo truck with trailer. Maximum loaded weight, 50 tons. If a bridge can take that, it presumably can take Booker. Now I get it, it's a simplistic statement when one considers weight over length, but as a single load it's still 40 tons on the vehicle versus 50 on the truck. If the bridges are in a training area, well, then who cares? It's training. Obstacles are a thing in real life. It's a tracked vehicle capable of going off-road, and anybody who's been on a tank base will have noticed that as you're driving on the road and crossing a bridge, the tank trail fords the river instead. You don't complain that the M1 is too heavy because the bridges in Fort Benning's training area can't hold the weight. Okay, M1 may actually be too heavy, but a US Army base's construction is not a good determinant for that. Further, of course, Booker was not intended to fight specifically in Fort Campbell anyway. It seems to me that if the Army is going to make an assessment of the percentages of roads and intersections the vehicle could go through in cities around the world, it may have also made an assessment of the percentages of the bridges that the vehicle could cross and made that a factor. Right to repair arguments? True, GDLS were doing most of the repair work, but that was because the Army hadn't taken over the responsibility yet. So at this time of recording, I am still waiting for approval to release a video on the log demo process, which I filmed on M10s back in August. Basically, until the Army certifies that the repair processes provided by the contractor actually work in Army conditions, the repairs are mainly the contractor's obligation. Once everything had been tested and certified, then the Army would take over the repair work. After the curtailment was announced, the program was put into a limbo. But you will note that the curtailment announcement said nothing about the plan for the, at the time, 2 battalions worth of vehicles that the Army was expecting to take delivery of. Put simply, the Army was still considering putting the vehicles into service. They could do exactly what they were supposed to do. They were still good vehicles. But with such a small fleet, that decision had to be balanced with sustainment costs per unit. If the vehicle were not capable of doing its intended job, that waiting period would have been unnecessary. Just cancel it and say we won't be using it. It took over 2 months for that decision to be made. So, if those weren't the issues, and if it genuinely was a good vehicle, what did kill it? And put simply, money. I was at an industry conference last summer, and an officer in procurement said something akin to, when Booker was in development, the Army was working on over 30 major programs of record. There was no way, if they all made it through the development process, that the Army could afford to buy them all. Now, there is an argument for making a statistical assessment that some programs will fail, and so you won't be spending your limited money on buying them. Same sort of concept as an airline overselling seats. Attrition will keep things within capacity. Have too many successful programs, however, and suddenly you have a problem. You have to prioritize. Now, remember at the very beginning of this video, I mentioned that you can argue whether the program to begin with was a good idea. The vehicle isn't perfect. You'll notice it doesn't come by default equipped with RWS, APS, and a few other things which realistically it needs to have. It's weight limitations. The reality is, after landing, you'd probably have to spend a couple of hours fitting stuff onto the vehicle. In which case, sending it off without a full combat load of ammo and fuel, and thus triggering that C-17 weight limit waiver requirement, isn't much of a problem. But hey, it's an area safe enough for you to land a C-17 in the first place, so, as I say, what's the hurry? Well, 2025 rolls around, and we have a new administration with something of a new focus, Indo-PACOM. Europe can take care of itself, but the US's power is critical in the Indo-PACOM region. The primary US military component in that theater is the US Navy, which, as has been well known for a while now, is not in a good place, undershipped, with a lousy capacity to build and repair what vessels they currently have. They probably need a few frigates. Maybe someone somewhere is thinking about a battleship. But ships and shipyards are really expensive, and they're going to suck up a load of DoD budget. The Air Force would also have a substantial role there also, and airplanes and missiles are also not exactly cheap, and this doesn't leave a whole lot of cash for the Army. And it's not as if the Army doesn't have its own things to spend some serious dollars on. Of the list of things which the Army really needs, and this includes new artillery, which seems to be sort of the Army's frigate equivalent, the Bradley replacement, the entirely new M1 tank, and, oh right, crap loads of counter-UAS capability. Does the M10 and its specific role in supporting light infantry really rank higher than those sorts of things? Not really. So to that end, the cancellation makes sense. And to that end, Mr. Miller's comments about inertia in the Defense One article are likely correct. Or maybe it was just sort of a political thing. The Army's had a bit of a run of bad luck creating vehicles recently. FCS, Crusader, NLOS, Urca, GCV. And suddenly, they have a program which is apparently working, on time, was on budget, and met doctrinal requirements. And you want to cancel it? Are you mad? Just because it may prove to be a luxury item we might not be able to afford? So what is going to happen to the 80-odd vehicles, which, as mentioned, works fine? A damn good question, and it seems nobody is talking. Now, unsurprisingly, once the decision to not field them in the US was taken, they were put on the foreign sales market. And there had always been countries interested in the vehicle, be it to be used as an assault gun or as a less heavy tank. But obviously, if the US suddenly wasn't going to buy it, then all the risk of sustaining this vehicle would go to that one smaller country. Now, there is precedent, such as Thailand's use of the Stingray light tank, but you can see why interest may be reduced. That said, there was still some interest. However, I was at DSEI in September and speaking to a procurement guy from one country, he told me that the vehicle had been pulled from sale. He did not know if that was because it had been sold, or because the US had reversed course and decided to use it domestically. Assuming his information is correct, it will obviously be interesting to see what comes of them. However, it does seem that the number may drop to 40, with a hell of a lot of spares. It may have been inevitable anyway. Apparently the costs for full production turned out to be higher than initially estimated, and none-McCurdy is a thing. All in all though, I kind of have to feel bad for almost everybody involved. The 13 vehicles that were fielded to the 82nd had all been taken back by August. GDLS engineers had built a good vehicle. The light infantry now have to live without their direct fire support, unless you grab the LAV 25s again. The Booker families don't get to see the vehicle that they attended the naming ceremony for in service. The project managers, ending with, you remember Lieutenant Colonel George, who managed to do something rare, successfully field a new armoured vehicle? The 19 kilos in Alphas who was supposed to go to this new stood-up unit had to find new homes. And I felt particularly badly for the battalion commander who had had his command pulled out for him a couple of weeks before he was supposed to get it. Apparently active duty folks get selected for battalion command a year or two earlier. Now, I hear he's been taken care of since though. So there you go. The tragic tale of the Booker, at least as best as I can relate with the publicly available information. What lessons can and will be learned from all this, well, we'll see. Hope you found it interesting and informative. Take care. Please hit that subscribe button. I really need it. And I'll talk to you on the next one.